Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Bottler, and I'm your host. I'm also principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find out more about at waterdisputes.org. My guests today are Sarah Kirkle, the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs for the Texas Water Association, and Perry Fowler, the Executive Director of the Water Infrastructure Network. Sarah, welcome to Talk+Water, and Perry, welcome back to Talk+Water.
Thanks
for having us.
It's good to be back. Thanks for allowing me to come back on after the last one.
Well, I have a short memory, is all I can say. So Sarah, as a newbie, a newcomer, I always like to ask our guests their first time, how you kind of figured out that you wanted a career in water. When was that kind of moment that you thought, this would be a great topic to spend my career devoted to?
I honestly don't know that I fully committed yet. I still feel like I'm trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. But my first exposure was when I worked at the Sunset Advisory Commission and reviewed the Water Development Board. And at that point, we got really deep into the groundwater policy and reformed the joint planning process through that Sunset bill, and I got very deep into DFC appeals, and that to me really sparked my interest in water because there are a lot of unanswered questions, especially thinking through our regulatory and supply frameworks. And so it's continued to be a really fascinating and technical and complex subject matter, as you're aware.
So DFC, desired future conditions.
Yeah.
And just thinking about that's how I met you during the Sunset process when the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority was under Sunset.
Mm-hmm.
So we are here today really to discuss what is going to be going on November 4th when we have an election in Texas on a number of propositions that resulted from the 89th Texas legislature, but in particular one called Proposition 4. And so a little background on that. The 89 Texas legislature was really a historical water session, I'd say. There were a number of water bills that made it across the finish line, but the primary focus was funding, and in particular, Senate Bill 7 and its companion House Joint Resolution 7 were the vehicles for this new funding. So, Sarah, why don't you start us off with what Senate Bill 7 and House Joint Resolution 7 do? What do those two accomplish together?
Yeah, so they provided a pretty significant overhaul on how we're going to be approaching funding for water infrastructure, and it added quite a few oversight provisions as well. So I would say the key piece of HJR 7, which it now is turned into Proposition 4, which you'll see on the November 4th ballot, really would dedicate $1 billion in existing sales tax revenue that's already coming into the state, and it would dedicate that towards the Texas Water Fund, which then would be available to communities to be able to apply for grants and loans to assist their communities with water, wastewater, and flood infrastructure. So that dedicated funding piece is definitely the biggest thing that came out of this. Water professionals, and Perry and Todd, you know this too, have been working for decades, nearly 30 years to really achieve a dedicated revenue source and we can talk about kind of the history of water funding in the future, but it's really just been in these fits and starts. We've not really had that consistent funding like you see in other policy mechanisms like transportation. So I would say that's the key. There are some details about how that money is spent, that half of it has to be spent in two programs. One is the New Water Supply for Texas Fund, and one is the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, which SWIFT funds our state water plan. The other 50% is discretionary for the Water Development Board. But some of the other key provisions in Senate Bill 7 bring in the remainder of the board's financial assistance programs under the umbrella of the Texas Water Fund, which essentially means that all of the board's financial assistance programs are now eligible for funding from the Texas Water Fund. So if statewide voters approve Proposition 4, that $1 billion will go into the fund, and the Water Development Board can decide which of those funds it wants to spend the money on. So before the last session, the Flood Infrastructure Fund, the Ag Water Conservation Fund, and the Economically Distressed Areas Program were missing from the eligibility. So it's exciting to see that put in there. There are significant changes to project eligibility for the new water supply fund. It added some additional types of projects to that. It put some restrictions on some others. So a lot of changes there. And then there were also a couple of provisions that are notable related to facilitating planning and best practices for water supply conveyance projects, especially when we talk about coordinating eminent domain and using existing easements. And there's also an interesting provision about adding wastewater to the state water planning process. So that's just a study, just an evaluation, because we do have a lot of needs on the wastewater front. But those are what I would say are the key additional things that happen in those bills.
And so that $1 billion, if it's approved by the voters, that's not just a one-time infusion of money. It's going to go on for 20 years, isn't it? Or
That's correct, yeah. So it's a little different from transportation, because transportation doesn't have an end date, and there's a process for the legislature to re-up it. But it is a 20-year dedication, so it's essentially $20 billion on the line.
Perry, you want to add anything?
I think Sarah covered it, and I think I'd like to reemphasize that having consideration for wastewater projects in there, it really is a big deal. So is the flood infrastructure fund, adding water reuse. I mean, these are things that a lot of us were trying to advocate for, I think, when we passed SB 28. But they came to fruition here, and it really is I think there's a lot of moving pieces, but it's all pointing in the right direction.
Well, let's, you hinted at this, Sarah, in your answer about kind of the history of water funding in Texas. And so let's kind of take a step back, way back, maybe, 50 years, 75 years or so. And after and during, I guess, the drought of record in the 1950s, Texas was getting a lot of money for water projects from the federal government. And it went on a reservoir building, kind of some people say a tear, right? But it built a lot of reservoirs. We built a lot of reservoirs in the decades after that drought, and that came to an end really in the 1980s. And so there was kind of a lull. And when it came back around, say around 2000, when people started thinking, maybe we need to start building some more reservoirs or building some other kind of water projects, because a lot of people were moving into Texas, there was somewhat of a hesitancy to really go back to the federal government in the way that had been done in previous decades for funding. And there was a great deal of discussion about, well, maybe Texas should be funding these projects, or the local communities should be funding them more than they had in the past. And so, kind of looking back to 2000, we had a couple of sessions where we approved new water financing sources, and they were nowhere near what the voters are about to consider here in November. But why don't we cover those other bills? I think 2013 is SWIFT and SWIRF.
Yeah, 2013 was SWIFT, which created the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, which is how we can actually make the water plan become a reality. Prior to that, in 2011, voters approved a $6 billion revolving bond authority for the Texas Water Development Board. And then here recently in 2023, we approved Prop 6, which provided the initial $1 billion capitalization for the Texas Water Fund, which is where these funds we're talking about now will be directed. So there's been a lot of significant activity here just within the last decade. Texas is finally getting serious about water funding, and it's really great that we're doing this right now.
I think one thing I would add is you really covered what happened in terms of federal money coming in for those reservoirs. But another piece of it is that whenever water and wastewater systems really were taking off, like the 50s to the 70s, there was a lot of federal money that was coming into communities to install these basic systems in these communities for the first time. And really it was a public health effort, right?
Right.
And those grants at the time then became and turned into just loans. And that's what we now know in the state revolving funds that come down to the Water Development Board. They are a key source of funding for a lot of communities, and it's very cost effective. But that shift from a grant to a loan, when you saw that shift happen in the late 70s, where are we at now, like 2026? What you're seeing is a lot of these communities who could never really afford to take care of and put in their infrastructure in the first place, that infrastructure that they got is coming to the end of their useful life. And I'm talking about a lot of smaller towns, right? Rural areas that don't have those rate bases to really be able to do a lot with their systems. And so this is another really important piece as we talk about not just the need for new supply, but also our need to deal with our aging infrastructure.
So that money you're talking about in the stimulus, that's Clean Water Act money.
Right, exactly.
And that bill, it's interesting, that bill was vetoed by President Nixon because he said it was a budget buster. It was a lot of money, but his veto was overridden, which tells you, the sentiment in the country, and also in Congress, right, to get money for those types of needs.
Yeah.
And so kind of looking at, where we are now and where we might be if Proposition 4 passes, is that all the money we need for implementing the water plan and replacing and upgrading our water infrastructure?
We use the term drop in the bucket. This is very significant, and the state has incredible leveraging opportunities with this $1 billion. But kind of back to the federal funding, and Sarah and I have worked a lot on this in the last several years. What we've been seeing in Texas is federal funding is not consistent. We're seeing more congressional earmarks. We're seeing those federal appropriations decrease. Mm-hmm. And frankly, if we hadn't had the IIJA funding here the last several years, we wouldn't have had a significant amount of funding going through those SRF programs, which is the state revolving fund. And there's the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Those have been the workhorse programs for a very long time in Texas. And primarily, low interest loans. There's some provisions that were made during the stimulus to allow for more grant type of money and things of that nature. But what we're seeing is that consistency that we had is not really there anymore. And I think that has really helped to raise some recognition about the fact that we can't count on Washington D.C. to solve our water problems. It's just not going to happen. So we need to have a Texas solution to be able to do this.
So our acronyms again. IIJ, infrastructure reduction or investment
in Jobs Act.
Jobs Act,
yes,
from the Biden administration.
Yes.
One other piece, though, beyond the federal piece, is that the ratepayers in local communities are really taking on more of a burden in paying for their systems, and they will definitely be taking on even greater in the future. So we have, I know people use the term hub and spoke all the time, but we've developed all of the cheap, easy water projects near our communities, and so we've got to go out further. Those projects are more costly, they're more complex, and when we think about the needs that we have right now, we have more than $200 billion in needs right now, and this $20 billion, again, really important to get us started, but it's a problem that all of us at all levels of government are going to have to really pitch in and work towards in order to cover these costs.
So that $200 billion estimate, is that include building out the 50-year water plan, or is
Yes.
that just, okay?
It does. It includes the state water plan, which is $80 billion. It includes the state flood plan, which is $55 billion. And then the current EPA needs survey is also $80 billion. And that's kind of like, those numbers are a few years old now. And so that's roughly a 20-year estimate. But the Water Development Board was testifying during the session that their initial regional plans coming in are giving them an indication that the cost of the state water plan, which right now is about $80 billion, is likely to nearly double in the 2027 plan. And so that's going to be really difficult for our communities to take on.
Right. I can validate that because as a representative of the construction industry, we're seeing these prices just become enormous. And it's not because the contractors are making a lot of money. It's just very expensive to deliver these projects. It's expensive to have the materials, the equipment, the supplies. Everything about it is more expensive. the Texas Water Development Board, even though SRF has been successful, it has never been able to meet the demand that it gets every cycle. They just passed the SRF intended use plan here recently at the board. They had billions of dollars of applications, and they're only able to put out so much to meet that amount. And it's not $1 billion, I can guarantee you that.
Yeah, it was 10 times oversubscribed last time. And I mean, just really sit down and think about that. For every application the board can fund, there are 9 communities who don't have access to funding for their project. And that's a really staggering statistic.
So Perry, kind of thinking back to the debate within the legislature during the regular session, and I know that you and Sarah are kind of y'all are down there all the time, the way I used to be years and years ago. There were some major lines of internal debate on the legislation that would provide this $20 billion. And so I wondered, could you kind of walk us through, where that debate was going and how it kind of morphed throughout the legislative session?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main issue that we were involved in, and I'm not going to get too far into the nasty details because it wasn't easy at all to get there, but the real big discussion is how much money are we going to allocate towards water supplies, and how much are we going to have that's discretionary for the Water Development Board to do all those other things that we need to do. Within those new water supplies, there's also a lot of discussion about new water, which there's a new water supply for Texas fund that was created under the previous bill that has certain parameters around it, which were expanded this time, which is good. But I think that there was a desire for a lot of folks to make sure that we were also continuing to capitalize the very successful SWIFT program. And so as we saw things kind of evolve throughout the discussions, we kind of eventually got to this 50-50 split, which I think is very reasonable. It really does allow the board to have discretion to put funds where they need to be. We have these planning processes in place, so we actually have a framework to do them in. That was really one of the biggest things that was in there. And frankly, I was kind of surprised that when it got down to it and we started seeing all these different things like water reuse and wastewater and things of that nature put into the bill, into SB 7, that seemed to happen with relative ease. The funding was the big question, how much and how it was going to be allocated. And I think initially we were hoping to have something more like $2.5 billion, but we ended up at $1 billion, which we're grateful for. But it's not enough. So, as Sarah mentioned, the communities are going to have to make up the difference, and these are investments that communities are going to have to make. They're not going to be something that you can just say, oh, I'm not going to do that, because when you don't have proper water treatment, communities have major public health and safety issues, and then water supply as well. So,
You want to add anything, Sarah?
Something that I've been hearing just in the frame of Proposition 4, there is some confusion about, people have concerns about certain local projects throughout the state and concern about whether, Prop 4 is going to be funding some of those efforts. And there's just beyond the allocation that Perry discussed, that was a point of conversation during the session. There's also legislative priorities about what they want to see funded. This money is subject to legislative appropriation. This money is got to be decided and allocated between programs by the Water Development Board. And then when the applications come into each program, they are going to be ranked based on very transparent, publicly available and vetted criteria. And so this money is really critical for communities to be able to access in not only the new water supplies for growth and for the economic development, but also to be able to fix their aging infrastructure, especially leaky pipes. We've had a lot of conversation about leaky pipes, and you can blame utilities for not necessarily having the funding to deal with that, but it's a supply issue if you're losing a significant amount. And so I think it's going to be really helpful to communities that have very diverse needs throughout the state to be able to access different kinds of programs for different kinds of projects. And so it's going to be really great to see the diversity of how this money is spent for those community needs.
So I think one of the things that you're hinting at there is that this is not really for these private water projects that you see in various parts of the state that been in the news a lot lately. This is money for projects that go through the regional water planning process and go through, a long, detailed process through the Texas Water Development Board.
That's true, and strictly private projects are not eligible for this money at all. And the other piece of conversation, I think there are 17 different amendments that are going to be on the ballot, and that is a lot, and a lot of them have some significant price tags. This is not one that raises any sort of taxes or fees. It's talking about taking an existing amount of our state sales tax, which has led to significant, $27-24 billion surpluses of the last few sessions, and dedicating $1 billion of that, just like we do for transportation, to water projects for the next 20 years. And so I think people need to understand. I know the ballot language is very complicated, doesn't even say the word water until I think the third line. So we do have some concerns just about how people will interpret that polling language, but we're hopeful that people will understand it and that we'll be able to convince them.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. The language in the prop is not great, but we're talking about existing funds here. This is about having a priority for water. I mean, that's what this boils down to. This is the state saying that this is something that we need to do with the funds that we have. This is something that we need to put towards that use. So just to that, there are when you actually read what the legislation does, I think that it's much more compelling, and there's a lot of good information out there about what is going to be accomplished with this fund, and clarify kind of the nature of the fund and how it's used. You can't really get that out of the 4 sentences that somebody wrote trying to capture what was in the legislation, from the bill title and all that good stuff.
So I want to get each of your thoughts on the prospects for Prop 4 to pass. There's probably some polling information out there, but tell me what you're hearing.
Well, Carrie and I have been on a lot of coordination calls with not just other water associations that are working on a campaign to promote Prop 4, but also a lot of industry, because water is critical to economic development in Texas. And the polling information that we've seen has indicated that there's less than 50% support for the proposition on its face, 48%. But the good news is that there's 30-something% that's undecided. And Harry, go ahead.
This is based on the ballot language. And so what they found in additional polling is that when people actually were informed and knew what they were voting for, that we got into the high 70s. And that's fairly typical, I think. That's where we were with SWIFT. That's where we were with Proposition 6.
Yeah, it's lower than last time, but I think what it tells us is that while we're really optimistic, we know how important water is. I think Texans understand how important water is, but we've got a real education effort on our hands. We've got to get the work done in order to educate the voters about what the stakes are in terms of Prop 4.
Yeah, and if you care about this, don't just expect somebody else to show up and put your vote in for you. I mean, you really have to get people to the polls. You really have to get your peers and family and colleagues and everybody out there. You can't leave it for somebody else to do.
Yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit about the ballot language. What is it that you think is kind of resulting in less support in the polling that you've seen than you might have otherwise expected?
Well, why don't I read it to you?
Perfect. Perfect, yeah.
It says, the constitutional amendment to dedicate a portion of the revenue derived from state sales and use taxes to the Texas Water Fund and provide for the allocation and use of that revenue. So the ballot language is very much focused on taxes. And that's very confusing, I think, to your average person, because you really have to break that statement apart to understand what it's doing.
Yeah, but it doesn't say increasing sales.
No, but it would be nice if it said existing revenues. That would be nice, and it'd also be nice if it said something about what it's for, which is for water supply and water infrastructure projects. I think that's a little bit more affirmative. So they try to be neutral on these proposition language for the various constitutional amendments, and that's fine. It just shows us that we have to educate, and there are a lot of folks that are out there doing that right now. There's going to be a lot more happening in the next several weeks. I think that it's exciting, and Texans that understand the issue are very, very supportive, and we've seen that consistently.
Well, and we got a drought going on too. I was wondering, is that, I would think it would help
I hope it helps.
Yeah.
I mean, typically it has, right? Texans understand, especially those who live around lakes with that big bathtub ring around it, that water's critical and that we've got to have enough during a drought. But I actually saw this fascinating chart that maybe needs to be more widespread. It was by Fries and Nichols, and it compared the amount of surface water that we have in the state to our population.
Right.
And when you look at those numbers, we are back in just before the 50s drought.
Right.
And so we did all that work that you mentioned to build all these reservoirs and improve our water supply situation, but our significant growth in the state has put us right back in that same spot.
So last night I was giving a talk to the Austin Geological Society, and I had a similar slide. I don't know if it's the one that you've seen, but it essentially said, okay, before the drought record or during the drought record in the 50s, we had about 500,000 gallons of storage space in reservoirs for every person in the state. And then after the drought was over, we got up to either 1 million or 1.5 million or something when we finished building all those reservoirs. Then we stopped building reservoirs, and people really started moving in the state, and we're back to about 500,000. And that's an old figure that I was quoting there. And so, of course, we have a lot more groundwater now than we did then, and we do have some other types of supplies, but still, it does tell you that in terms of the ability to supply the state's needs with surface water, we're kind of back to where we were decades ago.
Yeah, and the supply conversation has shifted for sure because we've got a lot of different solutions for water supply, and some are existing, some are reusing, and all sorts of different types of new water as well. But we've really got to make sure that we have opportunities to tap into all of those different types. I mean, when I talk to the members of the Texas Water Association, they're not looking for one magical reservoir that's going to solve all of their needs. They're looking at a very diverse portfolio to be able to tap into different types of water at different times and really conjunctively use that when available, because I think it's not just one silver bullet solution here, right? We're going to have to use all the solutions to be able to meet our needs.
Yeah, and that's something we have seen in the drought. I mean, the systems that don't have redundancies basically are really putting themselves in a big bind. So some of the options that we have through the new fund will allow them to maybe mitigate some of that, which is going to be a good thing for sure.
Well, I think I'm going to kind of hope that the rain starts on November 5th. The day after the election. Thinking back to big water elections, I've seen a few where the water provision did not pass. Now prior to our time, I was 5 years old or so, but there was a statewide vote on funding the 68 water plan, and that one failed by just a few thousand votes, but. This is probably the biggest water vote since then, I would think. I can't think of one that's really more consequential.
No, and I think that this is a fiscally responsible way to go about this. Making arguments that the state doesn't have a role in this are absolutely absurd. I mean, the state depends on water. Each community in the state of Texas depends on water, and ultimately the user is going to pay that. What this is going to do, if it's successful, is it's going to offset some of those costs. It's going to make these projects viable. It'll make them more affordable. And in some areas like Austin, where we've got $1 billion wastewater treatment plant, we've got $1 billion drinking water plant in Houston. These $1 billion projects are going to keep on coming, and they're getting more expensive, and that's just the way it goes. But conversely, if you look at a smaller community that may have a $30 million water plant that they have to build, the burden is as great or more so on them. And so being able to have funds to offset that and have these economies of scale are a good thing. They're a really good thing. So it doesn't matter if you're in Houston or Austin or San Antonio or Dallas or Palestine or Lubbock or Waco or Cotulla, Texas, there's something in here for everyone to address the specific needs of your community.
Yeah.
And that's why this is really great. And having that flexibility with the fund is going to help us get there.
Well, you kind of kicked off the next question, Perry, and that is, what the long-term impact of this money will be if it's approved by the voters. You want to add to any of that, Sarah?
Well, I'll just note that there are communities right now that can't take care of their own water infrastructure needs because they can't access financing from a bank. And so having an opportunity to go to the Texas Water Development Board and get cost-effective financing, subsidized interest rates, and there are grants available for certain types of communities, especially smaller disadvantaged ones and depending on their needs. But I mean, a lot of it is loans, and a lot of that money is recycled, and as it's paid back, it's used for communities who have needs in the future. And so it's a really cost effective and it's fiscally sound approach to how we're going about this. And it's very similar, again, the funding source is just what we do for transportation. So it's easy for people to sit in traffic and think about what the state needs in terms of transportation, but water infrastructure is hidden. And so sometimes people forget about those needs because those pipes are underground.
Right.
Yeah, when that tap doesn't turn on, it becomes a pretty severe crisis. I always say you can't drink a road. Well, water is completely different. It shuts everything down. It's a terrible thing to have occur, and it's happened in Texas. And most of it's been attributable to aging systems that are out there that just can't function.
Well, and I got to give my members and public water systems out there props because we're facing really significant water challenges, but not. To Perry's point, as long as the tap is turning on and the toilet's flushing, sometimes people don't realize how significant that is because the systems have done such a great job of trying to maintain just basic functions and reliability.
Right. There's also comes into play here is the perception of value in terms of water. A lot of people are willing to pay, 7,000 times as much for the same volume of water comes out of their tap by buying a bottle of water at a convenience store, right? But, they get really upset when their local water utility increases their rates to keep, their infrastructure up to snuff. And so,
Bottled water costs more per gallon than gasoline.
Yeah.
So consider that. Consider why it's important to have good funded public water systems that work and that are accountable. Just from a cost basis alone on that, it's something that's a very compelling argument that people should consider.
So we have discussed, kind of the $200 billion that might be, what's the long-term need. If the voters approve Prop 4, we may also, I guess, see some renewed efforts to get additional money in future sessions. And any thoughts about whether this is kind of the first phase or kind of the sense that you might have gotten during the legislative session about whether this is what we're going to provide and we're not going to be talking about water financing for a long time, or any thoughts on that?
Well, one thing that's important to understand is if and when the voters pass this money doesn't kick in until 2027. Fortunately, the legislature did make a historic investment in water this session. That was something that Governor Abbott called for in his emergency item. Approximately $2.5 billion, and some of that money has already kind of been out there, and so we're kind of double dipping a little bit on that. But for the most part, it's a very significant amount of funding, which is probably more like 1.5, 1.8, something like that, I think. But again, we're not going to have any other additional state funds coming in this next 2-year cycle. That's not going to happen. In the future, we'll have this $1 billion coming every year, but I still don't think that's going to be enough. We folded flood into the water fund, and in the last several sessions, that's been receiving almost $500 million, per biennium. So now we're putting flood underneath that discretionary part of the funding at the Water Development Board. And so what I think you're going to see is that this is going to be a great start. I think that this is going to allow the board to start leveraging and planning to an extent that's going to get us the most bang for our buck. But it's not going to be enough. And so I think that this is going to be a continuing discussion, and just to say, hey, we solved it this time, we're good forever. It's just not accurate. But this is a great step in the right direction.
I think that the nature of the conversation will shift. I mean, not only you've got the timeline issues that Perry laid out. That's going to take probably this kind of a conversation off the table, at least next session, perhaps the session after that. But we have some very large projects in the state. Communities are struggling with how to pay for them. We've got a couple of high-profile projects that are, those communities are having questions about it because the costs are double, triple what they thought that they were signing on to. And they're, small communities are not going to be able to afford a project on their own. I think we're sort of looking towards the need to regionalize, which we already know is a great idea in terms of like the cost efficiencies and the scale. But just because from a practical perspective, they've got to share those costs with other folks. There are likely some very big projects, either strategic pipelines or some of these newer technologies that are more expensive that are going to have to be a part of this supply conversation. And so I just think that in some cases, those projects may be so big that one entity can't take them on, even a large entity, a regional entity. So we have to start thinking at some point, not just the bottom-up approach, but also the top-down, and what does that look like? Does that look like the state funding projects in the future? There could be any number of ways that you can structure those kind of financing deals, but I think the nature of that conversation is going to start shifting as the types of projects that are available shifts.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of these big regional projects, and they happen because of SWIFT.
Yeah.
Areas south of Austin, IPL up near Dallas, Alliance south of us here. I mean, these are projects that receive SWIFT funding that have multiple entities and stakeholders involved in them that serve a lot of people in our growing state. If you just look north and south of I-35, the growth is enormous, all the way up the I-35 corridor. And if you look at where the really water-stressed area is in Texas, it's right along that corridor, kind of all the way down south and into the valley. North Texas has been blessed with a good bit of rain. So they're looking better up there right now, but it's kind of scary down here. And I think that kind of lends itself to, how much are you willing to pay for a glass of water if you're thirsty and if you need to have it. And you probably don't care at the end of the day. So take that off the table. Let's make responsible investments that are affordable so that we don't have to go to these extremes to be able to meet needs, because if you don't have the water and you don't have an alternative, then you're up the creek. Good water metaphor there.
What's IPL?
That's the integrated pipeline, and it's a project that was done by Tarrant Regional, the city of Dallas, and I think at least one other big utility up in North Texas. But it's basically allows them to move all that water around where it needs to go. And that's one of these discussions right now is how do we get the water from where it is to where it needs to be? It's expensive. It's very expensive. And
do we do that at all? I mean, that's a big conversation
and there's
too.
That.
I think from a big supply conversation, it's just about certainty. I mean, there has been some local pushback about some certain types of projects. During the session, we had conversations about reservoirs. There was pushback on reservoirs. There was pushback on ASR. There has been pushback on the desal proposed projects. Now there's pushback on groundwater export. I think this really just raises a bigger supply conversation about, okay, if we are going to tackle our supply needs, what is on the table and what is off the table, and let's find a strategy to be able to move forward.
So, Sarah, you just hit on something that takes me to our next question. We had a special session after the regular session, which resulted in the passage of Senate Bill 7 and House Joint Resolution 7. And in the special session, or a couple special sessions, I guess, we had, legislation on flooding as a result of the July 4th floods. And we also had a discussion about groundwater projects, as you just alluded to. And so I'm curious what y'all see having come out of those sessions and what that might portend for the next session, the 90th session in 2027.
Well, I'll say the legislature did take a lot of proactive steps related to the flooding during the special sessions. It was a definite priority. We got some money out there, especially for the Hill Country impacted disaster areas for flood warning systems and sirens. There was some overhauls in terms of, youth camp safety and how we deal with flood emergency response, which is sort of out less in the water space. But there were some bigger ideas about flood related and especially specifically the disaster response piece that did not pass. So I think those conversations will continue. So that's somewhat in the flood vein. It, I think, is really great that the legislature moved the Flood Infrastructure Fund under the Texas Water Fund so that if Prop 4 is passed, flood projects will be eligible for money in the way that the Flood Infrastructure Fund didn't have that continuous dedicated source. It's also a challenge in terms of our competing water infrastructure needs because flood infrastructure really does take a larger grant component to get projects done than you typically see with water and wastewater. And that's because there's not a dedicated revenue source. Like you have people pay water and wastewater rates, nobody's paying flood rates. There are some drainage districts, and so you do have that source. And Harris County Flood Control District is really a unique animal that's very sophisticated, but it's not something that's really ingrained across the rest of the state. And add to that, the challenges with flooding are that it's very multi-jurisdictional. So in a flood issue, solving your community's flood issue may mean working with several other communities perhaps upstream, and that creates a lot of politics and collaboration, plus figuring out the funding. These projects are just a little bit harder to get off the ground. So because of that, you got to have that higher grant component, and that money goes very fast in the flood programs.
But we do have a plan. We have the flood infrastructure plan, which is we have to. I want to say thanks to Brooke Pop for making that happen. We have a plan.
Texas flood plan, right?
Yeah, and we know how much it's going to cost, and we know what we need to do. You have to have that information to be able to be successful. We have that information for our water supplies. We need to have a comprehensive look at what our financial needs are to meet our water demands in Texas. This is going to help get us there because you have all these different things under one umbrella, and that's really going to allow the board to go and look and say, where do we need to prioritize funding now? What do we need to do to plan accordingly so that when people are ready to do a project, they can go? And this opens that up for us to be able to accomplish that. I mean, it's huge in that respect. The flood component, it's tragic, and everyone in Texas has dealt with that over the course of the last decade in some way, shape, or form. We have a means to do it. I hope that this is an adequate amount of money. I think we're going to have additional appropriations down the road. It's entirely possible, but hopefully with the flexibility that we're granting the board, they can direct those funds where they need to be when they need to be there and when those communities are ready to undertake these projects. And we've never been able to really do that before.
How about groundwater? Groundwater came up.
We're going to have a big conversation about groundwater. Yeah, it started this year. I mean, I think y'all saw Chairman Cody Harris had an interim hearing really about a local groundwater export permit. They're not applying for an export permit yet, but that is the intended use of this very large production permit that they are seeking. And it really raises a lot of big policy issues in groundwater. Are we talking just about export permits and moving that water out of a community over somewhere else? How much is too much? Where is that line? Is it an issue just about moving that water out? Is it about large production permits? We've got all these data centers coming to the state, and they're using, as much water as a small to medium-sized city in some cases. And so is that going to be something, where's the line on what's responsible use of our natural resources? And anytime you open up groundwater conversations, you open up a whole lot of conversations about, just our basic management and regulatory framework.
Right.
And so I think any of those, you pull on one thread and it just kind of is going to bring in all these different pieces.
And it's going to be an evolving discussion, and I think that we will see a lot more discussion in the interim, and we'll see some legislative activity in the next session on this specifically. But I also note that in the regular session, there were some very earnest attempts to go out and provide additional funding to have good data on groundwater. House Bill 1400 being one of those bills, and there's actually a pretty decent appropriation that was directed to that, because that bill didn't pass. But I think that the groundwater is certainly on people's minds, but it's also something that we need to consider that is a viable resource and it can be responsibly managed. But in order to do that, we have to have the science, we have to have that framework to be able to do it. And that's why why this is going to be so interesting to see how this conversation evolves, because we haven't had any major changes in groundwater law in Texas in quite a long time, and we're still living by the rule of capture, which didn't have its origins in Spanish colonial law, I believe.
It's English.
English,
yeah,
okay.
Acton versus Blundell in 1843. It's a case in England, and that it's derived from Roman law prior to that.
And definitely there's a few counties without a GCD, without a groundwater district that do face some of those issues. But I think the rule of capture issue is really a red herring. I mean, we've got GCDs who have tools, should they use them, to be able to, more judiciously make decisions about how they locally manage their groundwater.
So I'm not gonna put you on a spot and ask you to respond to this, but just my observation, and you're getting nervous. Don't get nervous. So just thinking back to this, I was doing research years and years ago about interbasin transfers and interbasin transfer policy. And it allowed me to go in and look at a lot of records having to do with legislative sessions in the 60s. And, thinking back, so Texas had, kind of the opposite of what we have now, but it's similar in some ways. It was a one-party state. The governor was Democratic and the legislature was Democratic. And at the time, in the 60s, the legislature was kind of divided on an east-west line based on water. And some of the big battles during those sessions were having to do with, water being developed in East Texas and then moved to West Texas. And there's some hints I can see in some of the discussions that happened during the special session that we may be kind of, there may be some old divisions reemerging that are based on geography. And so, that's something, maybe it's just me. I don't know. I may be, seeing something that's not there, but it's just interesting to me, and I'm kind of watching for that in the future to see, should that actually reoccur.
Well, but I'll tell you this, and this is, I think, something that people need to understand. The chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee is from East Texas. He supports this. He was one of our bill authors. He understands that if we're able to do this, it's going to take pressure off of those communities because we're going to be able to do other things. And we're looking at this from a macro perspective for the entire state of Texas. The communities in East Texas, they have aging water infrastructure issues. They've got leaking pipes. If we're going to develop this water and then half of it leaks out, it seems kind of counterintuitive to do that. But we have enormous water loss, especially in a lot of our large communities. And this is something that's going to help us address that.
Right. This is unrelated to Prop 4. This is, I'm not really talking about Prop 4.
Right. But it all kind of comes together. But I would hope that we have a very deliberate conversation in the interim about this, and that that we're able to come to some reasonable solutions. But just saying that you have to take it completely off the table, I don't think that's the appropriate way to do things. But as Sarah mentioned, giving these groundwater conservation districts the authority to be able to make deliberate decisions that are smart and science-backed is a good thing. And it doesn't seem like this has been stopping the growth in Texas at all. And that makes me nervous sometimes. I see all these growing communities that are out there, and I know that they're in certain areas where there's limited supplies, and what are we going to do? So this is going to help kind of get us there, and it's going to take some big, bold thinking. It's like Charles Perry said, he wants to go big on this stuff, and we're going to have to on a lot of these. We're going to have to go big. We're going to have to innovate. We're going to have to make big financial commitments, and it's going to be interesting to see how this all evolves moving forward.
I think you're right. I think there will be geographic divisions. I mean, people ask me all the time, when we talk about water policy, are we talking about this as a rural-urban issue? And yeah, of course, you've got that. But it's also, especially when you're talking about groundwater, it's also a rural versus rural issue. And you've got property owners everybody wants to claim private property rights, and that's great, but you have two different types. You have the ones that want to exercise their right to conserve it in place, and you have the owners who want to exercise their private property right by monetizing that asset and selling it, and that's where the rub is.
Yeah, it's the same debate that I encountered over and over again in the Edwards Aquifer in the 90s, right? You know, and so we'll see what happens going forward. It's going to be interesting, and you know what the old saying is. I guess the Chinese saying, "May you live in interesting times." We live in pretty interesting water times right now.
Yeah.
All right, last question. So how can my listeners learn more about your work? So Sarah, let's start with you.
Yeah, so Texas Water Association, you know, we changed our name last year from the Texas Water Conservation Association, really just to really keep up with the times. The term conservation has evolved over time, and so we have really done a lot of proactive efforts on our communication of who we are and what we do. And so please check out our website. We have 3 conferences a year that are really great networking events for water professionals around the state. And we do a lot of conversations about policy issues that are really front and center at the Texas legislature specifically. So come check us out. We have some resources on our website too about, you know, what happened during the session, a recap, you know, summaries of SB 7 and HJR 7, information about Prop 4. So remember to get out and vote on November 4th, or early voting, which is October 20th through the 31st. I know you're not asking me about that question, but I have to put a plug in. Everybody go vote for Prop 4.
October 20th. That's when you can go put that vote in there.
Early voting.
Yeah. So I have to just say I'm all for shorter names. Yeah, Texas Water Association, I think it's great. I would have liked to have had collaborative water instead of collaborative water resolution, but I got talked out of that. Perry, how about you? How can we find out?
Well, we messed up with our name because the Texas Water Infrastructure Network is a long one. So we go by TexWin. That's what we call it. If you want to learn more about our organization, you can go to our website. It's txwin.org. We also have a pretty strong presence on X or Twitter. Really try to kind of convey what's happening in water out there to people so they understand the scope and magnitude of it. I would also recommend people to look at our LinkedIn page. A lot of good information there as well. But if you seek it out, there's great water information all across the state. I mean, Texas Water Foundation, Texas 2036, Sierra Club, Environmental Defense. I mean, all these different groups, the business community, environmental community, you know, infrastructure, everyone is focused on this. And there is a lot of unanimity here, and there's more of that than not. So,
yeah, I think you left out Texas Water Journal, maybe.
And then there's this thing called the Texas Water
Water
Journal, which does a fantastic legislative wrap-up and just really great stuff. I mean, and Texas +Water. Look, there's great resources out there.
We're in such a great spot with, as Perry said, everybody's on the same side right now, especially when you're talking about the need for more money to help communities, fix their infrastructure. You know, the collaboration among our water associations and groups is, it's never been better.
That really is an excellent point. I mean, you do see, real collaboration, across the spectrum in terms of, entities that are involved in water and, you would think would have very different positions, but, they've all been able to come together, it seems like.
Yeah, we work great together.
Well, let's end it there. So, Sarah and Perry, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Vote early.
And often.
Vote. Don't vote often. Just vote early and make sure all your friends go vote too.
Bring your friends.
Bring your friends to the polls with you.
There you go. This has been Talk+Water. My guests today were Sarah Kirkle, the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs for the Texas Water Association, and Perry Fowler, the Executive Director of the Texas Water Infrastructure Network. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. And finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Jones at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University and Sarah Wingfield for getting this episode of Talk+Water ready to flow. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please subscribe to the podcast and leave a review to let us know how we did. My name is Todd Butler. Let's talk water again soon.